The most obvious example being the passive language, for example. When Israeli soldiers shot a 4-year-old girl, and his phrasing was something like, the bullet found its way into the van and collided with a 4-year-old young lady. When Russia bombs a hospital, it bombs a hospital. And that's in the headline, and that's described as such. Hospitals in Gaza spontaneously combust. Journalists shouldn't be doing this. Journalists are the last people who should be doing this. My cynicism with regards to the institutional load-bearing beings of the West, political, journalistic, cultural, you name it, that knows no bounds. My cynicism for that knows no bounds. Are they really going to try to take over Greenland? Are they really going to try to make Canada the 51st state? Is it going to be the new Riviera of the Middle East? And the point is to turn it all to mush, so that people throw up their hands and say, you know what, as long as my paycheck arrives every other Friday, let them do whatever the hell they want. I can't process this. My name's Omar Akkad. I'm a writer. I was born in Egypt. I grew up in the Middle East. Came to Canada when I was 16. These days I live in Portland, Oregon. I write the most depressing books you'll ever read. Usually fiction, but my most recent one is nonfiction. Yeah, so in very early November of 2023, my editor was in town in Portland, and we went out for dinner, and I was raving and ranting about just not knowing what my place was in the West anymore. And I think he just got so sick of listening to me do this that a few days later he called and said, you should start writing about it. And, I'm not good at most things, but I can write. And so that makes writing, among many other things, my first avenue of retreat. When I don't understand the world, when I have trouble making sense of something, and I've had trouble making sense of this ongoing atrocity now for a year and a half, I retreat onto the page and sort of try to make sense of it there. And that's how this started. I didn't know that it would be a book. I didn't know that I'd end up sitting here talking with you about it, a year and a half later. But I couldn't write about anything else, and I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing or even attempt to make sense of it unless I was writing about it. So that's essentially how it came together. First draft was done by about March of 2024. And then I just rewrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it. And honestly, if there wasn't a hard pub date, I would just still be rewriting it now. A lot of the rewriting was because of things that were presented as facts initially turning out to be complete nonsense. And certainly that hasn't stopped since this book went to print. And I shudder to think, this is after a couple of months. What does it look like a couple of years from now? How much of this stuff turns out to be completely fabricated? So the only job I've ever had, the only job I've ever held down was as a print journalist. I was a reporter for 10 years. And it was my education, it was my way of understanding the world and sort of getting a front row seat to a lot of history. But I think one of the defining aspects of being a journalist is taking the time to understand how something really works or what something really is. I know that my colleagues are not oblivious. They're in the business of decidedly not being oblivious. That is essentially the definition of a journalist, right? And you see this over and over again when it's safe enough. And I think for a very long time, Palestine hasn't been safe enough. And so what you get is an entirely different tool set that comes into play. A kind of tool set that is much more related to self-preservation than it is towards any kind of accurate presentation of what's happening. The most obvious example being the passive language, for example. I was watching, I think it was an anchor in this country, at a news program in this country, who was talking about when Israeli soldiers shot a 4-year-old girl, and his phrasing was something like, the bullet found its way into the van and collided with a 4-year-old young lady. What the hell is a 4-year-old young lady? What is that? Somebody explain that construction to me. And you see this all of the time in other industries. The language of press releases or the language of the sort of smirking press secretary at the White House. journalists shouldn't be doing this. Journalists are the last people who should be doing this. And a lot of the book, I think, was focused on that arena because the counterexamples are so glaring. You know, when Russia bombs a hospital, it bombs a hospital. And that's in the headline, and that's described as such. Hospitals in Gaza spontaneously combust. That was a source of frustration, both because this is the industry that I worked in and continue to work in on and off, so I know it well, but also because this is a lubricant, right? Like when this happens, it eases the way for more atrocity. It manufactures the conditions to allow this sort of thing to keep happening. So it's not even that these flagrant violations of what journalism should be are happening in a kind of vacuum or off to the side. They are intertwined, just as the lies about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq were intertwined with the destruction of that country and upwards of 1 million people. I think that's why I spent so much of the book in that arena. I think those are two very different questions. I think we're seeing it because we're seeing a lot of things that have maybe been the case for a very long time. But if you live in this part of the world, you could essentially look away from without consequence. And after a year and a half of live stream genocide, there are a lot of things that are a lot harder to look away from now. One of which being these continual sort of surveys in which the attitude of the Israeli public is very much towards the expulsion of all Palestinians everywhere in that territory. I don't know that this is new. Obviously, everything is heightened over the last year and a half, but I don't think it's fundamentally new. I think the acceptability question is very difficult to answer without sort of linking this to the nature of settler colonialism. By its nature, I think an enterprise like colonialism is insatiable. It's an act of endless taking. And the earlier taking is of the land, of the resources, of the lives that get in the way. But as you progress, the taking doesn't stop there. There's the taking of narrative. I don't know what it's like in the UK, but in North America, every literary festival begins with a land acknowledgement. We begin with somebody walking up to the podium and talking about how we are standing on the unceded indigenous territory. That is an after-the-fact acknowledgement, long after the damage was done. But I think it's part and parcel of how someone can convince themselves that they are liberal, that they're progressive, that they believe in this sort of array of opinions or worldviews, but at the same time still benefit from either the immediate taking or the after effects of taking. Would I be very surprised if towards the end of my life I'm invited to a literary festival in Tel Aviv that begins with land acknowledgements? Not really. I don't know how a settler colonial project functions any other way. I mean, Palestinians are a people who are standing in the way of this taking. And so I can fully understand why the project would have such immense rage at their existence. I don't know how this ends. I have no idea how this ends. But this notion that you can simply do away with a people so that a project of endless taking can become cleaner never quite works out that way. Palestinians have resisted for the better part of a century. And they're going to continue to do so. So this is, I think, the first live stream genocide. Historically speaking, in situations like, for example, the war in Vietnam, some of the turning points were the imagery, the imagery of what it looks like when these bodies are split apart, the sort of grotesque nature of violence at an industrial scale. And I think you have something similar happening here, but chronologically speaking, there's an immediacy and an intimacy that I think happens in social media in a way that it doesn't necessarily happen when you wait for the following night's news broadcast. It's much more difficult to control from any kind of standard state perspective. And I don't know what it's like here, but in the US, we got as far as the government essentially voting to ban TikTok. And it was very clear what the motive for that was. There was a central narrative, and then there was this incredibly diffuse thing on the side that was just shooting pellets into the central narrative. I don't like social media. I'm not good on social media. A lot of it is frivolous nonsense. But as a means of accessing that information in something very close to real time, I think we're going to be feeling the after effects of that for a very long time. Because, I've written this book that I don't think of as particularly controversial. Maybe it will be. I don't care. But when I talk to people about it, the biggest difference in perception isn't along ethnic lines or religious lines or even political worldview, conservative, liberal. It's generational. When I talk to older folks about writing this book, the response was always don't do that. Don't. When I talk to younger folks, there is nothing in the description of this book that phases them for even a second. And so I think you're going to see that sort of reverberate, particularly for an entity like the Democratic Party in the US, which I think has lost a generation, effectively. Not just an election, not just an election to one of the worst human beings ever to run for president, not just that loss, but the people that you are presenting your incredibly disjointed position to, where the White House spokesperson gets up and says, we are doing more for the Palestinians than any other government on earth, and we want a lasting peace, and then you pick up your phone and you see that this is nonsense, and you see it in the most grotesque way possible. That has caused a chasm to start to build. And I think they're going to feel that for a very long time. I don't know how much of this is possible were it not for the social media infrastructure. And I think this is going to happen in multiple ways as we go forward. So the beginning of my adulthood coincides almost exactly with the September 11th attacks. I was 19, I think, when that happened. And there was a certain kind of trajectory of narrative in the West, which began with complete silence. You don't talk about this. You fall in line, and everybody fell in line. And then slowly you can talk about some of the atrocities that are happening left, right, and center in Afghanistan or Iraq, but you're going to be sort of pushed off to the side. That is not part of the central narrative. But then what you saw years later was all these former Marines coming back and writing short story collections about how sad it made them to kill all those brown folks, right? There was an entry point into a different kind of story, but the storyteller had to be from a particular group and a particular privileged group. And then slowly over time, maybe we can let these people tell their own stories, kind of thing. And I think you're going to see something similar here, but the nature of just how accessible the evidence of atrocity is, I think is going to compress that quite a bit. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I mean, we're here at the most active and grotesque part of what is still a 75 plus year process. I think for me that there was, in the lead up to this moment, many other moments sort of disconnect. When I was out in Afghanistan and I was watching how the locals were guarding the outer wire where all the car bombings are going to happen, and the NATO troops are further back. There's a hierarchy of whose life is worth more. When you go to a place like Guantanamo Bay and you start to see the language of violence, of the bureaucracy, the euphemism, there's no interrogations, there's reservations, we never bomb a wedding party, that's collateral damage. You start to see all of this, and one of the ways, at least in my experience, and I think in hindsight an incredibly naive sort of way to look at it, is that yes, this is all happening, but there's a bedrock underneath of respect for equal rights and international law and this sort of fabric that is holding the thing together. After a year and a half of watching essentially every hallmark of war crimes law, international law, acceptable behavior by states, by combatants, all of that shredded to pieces, it is very difficult now to go back to that previous position of no matter how bad things get, there is this fundamental fabric holding it all together, because I've seen that fabric come apart. I should say that I'm aware that when I write a book like this, there's going to be the knee-jerk reaction of, well, you don't like it, get the hell out sort of thing. And I get all of that. What has happened to me generally, and what continues to happen to me now that the book is done, is my cynicism with regards to the institutional load-bearing beams of the West, political, journalistic, cultural, you name it. That knows no bounds. My cynicism for that knows no bounds. But I've had the almost opposite experience with respect to what individuals are doing and what communities are doing, what people are doing in solidarity with one another. I have leached so much courage from these folks who are doing things that I'm clearly not brave enough to do. I mean, I wrote a book, who cares? There's people chaining themselves to the gates of weapons manufacturers. There's people going to Gaza and doing surgery on children in the middle of this grotesque bombing and killing spree. I have immense faith in individuals. I have immense faith in what we can do as a community. What I've completely lost faith in is the guy in the suit who walks up to the podium at the White House and tells me something that, relative to what I am seeing with my own eyes, is complete horseshit. There's something almost cathartic about watching somebody sort of take off the performative corset and just be a fascist and just sort of present himself as an agent of unending cruelty, always pointed down, always pointed at the most vulnerable. I cannot begin to tell you what the next 4 years under Trump are going to look like. There is nothing that would surprise me at this point. I am furious at this administration, and it feels like it's been 2 years or something. It's been a couple of weeks, you know. It's been 3 weeks, right? It feels like it's been years, and I am furious at how openly and wantonly cruel they are. I am also furious that what is supposed to be the opposition to this, the Democratic Party, the liberal, progressive sort of mode, has failed so spectacularly that we are now in a position where we have to deal with this guy. And we have to deal with this dismantling of the civic fabric. I think one of the things that pisses me off the most is that I doubt very much that anybody within the Democratic leadership is ever going to be held to account for thinking that the best way to beat the Republicans was to present Americans with Republicanism light, was to give them Liz Cheney, was to send Bill Clinton to go tell Arabs in Michigan how great it is that their relatives keep getting killed. They've learned nothing. They've learned nothing from this. And it makes me furious because even a remotely coherent message of compassion, of some sense that international law matters, that human rights matter, any of that could have saved us from this. And instead, we got a bunch of smug power players telling us to ignore a genocide. Well, people didn't ignore a genocide, and here we are. Yeah, I mean, he speaks of it as a colonizer. There's no costume. There's no performance. There's plenty of evidence that the Biden administration tried very quietly in the early part of this genocide to get Egypt to essentially do some version of this. maybe without the like Trump towers lining the coast or whatever the hell this guy has in mind, but it was done quietly, and you still put on the performance of not being the kind of person who would do this, or not being the kind of administration that would do this. And I think one of the really shocking things about the Trump administration in general is this notion that there is no attempt to do what is naturally expected in this situation, which is to sort of dress it up in a different kind of language. And it's very mask off. Again, one of the hallmarks of this administration is the flooding of the intellect and the flooding of the sort of conscience with just calamity after proposed calamity. And it becomes difficult to tell what's actually intended versus what he's going to forget about because he finds a shiny new thing next week. Are they really going to try to take over Greenland? Are they really going to try to make Canada the 51st state? Is it going to be the new Riviera of the Middle East? And the point is to turn it all to mush so that people throw up their hands and say, you know what, as long as my paycheck arrives every other Friday, let them do whatever the hell they want. I can't process this. And it was the hallmark of his previous administration. Can you tell me the scandal, 6 years ago today? Is it possible to even recall the litany of horrific things this guy proposed or did? I think it's similar to the sort of disinformation and that sort of propaganda network that is not designed to get you to believe the wrong thing. It's designed to make you susceptible to believing anything or nothing or contradictory things all at once. This, I think, is the policy version of that, is to turn the whole thing to mush. And then, his son-in-law ends up making a ton of money off of it or something like that. It becomes very base when you rip all that stuff apart. I was on a Zoom call once for a climate anthology, and that question, a version of that question, how do you stay optimistic? Where's hope for you? It was the last one of the session, and everybody gave an answer that's sort of what you'd expect, except the last guy, whose house had just burned down in the California wildfires, and he said something like, "There is no hope. We've screwed things up enough that there is no hope, but we must behave as though there is." And I tend to think along those terms. I wake up a lot of days and I'm very, very dejected. I don't know how one can be anything else. I've become accustomed over the last year and a half to understanding that if I'm scrolling through my Twitter feed or whatever, and there's a picture of a smiling Palestinian child, it's because that child was just killed. I've become conditioned to that now. It's very difficult to maintain any sliver of humanity and optimism and the sort of things that would carry you through a normal day when that is your experience. And I'm saying this as somebody whose children have not been torn limb from limb, whose neighborhood hasn't been razed, whose bloodline hasn't been wiped off the face of the earth. For me, the optimism comes from knowing that despite the fact that every single power center of Western colonialism, of capitalism, despite the fact that every single one of these wants us all to look away, so many people are not looking away and are doing the work. Sometimes that work feels like nothing. The writing of this book feels like nothing. It feels like, whose mind is this going to change? What is this going to do? But you get up and you do it anyway. You do whatever the hell you can. Because, I didn't pick the title of this book out of thin air. I firmly believe that when it's safe, everyone will not be able to think about the killing of tens of thousands of children as a move on a chessboard, as some kind of pragmatic, great game policy thing. We are human beings at the end of the day. And right now it might not be safe for certain people to stand up, but a lot of people are sure as hell standing up anyway. I've learned over the years that the book I intend to write and the book the reader reads can often be very, very different things. But I go back a lot to this thing Ishiguro said about how all literature is just somebody saying, this is how it feels for me. Can you hear me? Does it also feel this way for you? And I think what I'm aiming for is a variant of that, of those statements. Over the last year and a half, I felt like I was losing my mind, because of the things I was seeing and because of the obvious brutality that is coming on at the end of, 3/4 of a century of brutality, and being told, no, this is good, your tax dollars should continue to fund this, you should keep killing those kids. You feel like you're losing your mind. And so if there's somebody else out there who feels that way, my hope is at least the book will function as somebody saying, you're not the only one who feels this. Beyond that, it's a book that comes barging in through the door pretending to be, throwing all these punches. I'm not trying to argue with anybody. I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. I am trying to find a common ground with somebody who also might have felt like they were losing their mind from this obvious disconnect between the performance of virtue and the very practical carrying out of atrocity. I'm going to disappear into the woods and I will never be heard from again. I'm on social media. I don't use it at all, but you can find me there. I'm on Twitter and Instagram.
More importantly, where can people find the book?
Where can people find the book? The book comes out February 13th. I'm so bad at this marketing stuff, man. I don't know. You can find it at bookstores, I guess. I'm trying to think of a non-obvious way of just saying.
This is fine. You can just compose a link over the top.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
It's take if you like.
You will find it discarded on subway trains, I think, where it's most likely to be.